The instant Luke Beaumont crossed the threshold of the Silver Spoon restaurant, entering through its revolving doors, an almost palpable tension seized the entire staff. His towering presence, a man of 6 feet 3 inches, was emphasized by the impeccably tailored charcoal suit he wore, an ensemble that likely surpassed their collective monthly earnings. He effortlessly commanded attention. His recent acquisition of the Manhattan restaurant chain, known for its upscale dining experience, had sent shivers of apprehension through all 5 establishments, though none felt it more intensely than the flagship location on Fifth Avenue. "He's here!" Jeffrey, the maitre d', hissed, adjusting his already perfectly positioned bow tie. "Remember what I said? Absolute perfection today." In the kitchen, Abby Mitchell, a young woman of 24, instinctively pushed a stray strand of auburn hair back under the confines of her cap, attempting to regulate her breathing. Unlike the other waitstaff, whose fear of the new owner stemmed from his reputation as a ruthless businessman, Abby's anxiety was rooted in something altogether different. She had recognized his name the moment the acquisition was announced. She had devoted 3 years of study to his business case in her international business program, an education she was unfortunately forced to abandon due to unforeseen financial constraints. "Mitchell, table 7 needs water, and Anderson requires backup on 12, Carlos, the floor manager, barked, his face visibly flushed with agitation. "And for God's sake, keep your head down when Beaumont is around. Rumor has it he fired an entire staff in Chicago for looking at him the wrong way." Abby nodded, filling water pitchers with hands that trembled slightly. Since Luke Beaumont's purchase of the Silver Spoon Group, the rumors surrounding him had spread like wildfire. Some whispered that he barely spoke English, relying primarily on his stone-faced assistant, Giselle, for communication. Others claimed he strategically conducted meetings in rapid-fire French to intentionally confuse American executives before acquiring their companies for a pittance. The most widespread rumor, however, was that he intended to dismantle the entire restaurant group, selling off its prime real estate locations and leaving hundreds jobless. As she pushed through the kitchen's swinging doors, carrying her tray of water glasses, Abby immediately spotted him. He was seated alone at the most coveted table in the restaurant, meticulously reviewing documents, in stark contrast to the boisterous business lunches taking place at most other tables. Despite her best efforts, she couldn't help but notice how the photographs in business magazines failed to capture the intensity of his presence. His dark hair, streaked with premature silver at the temples, was cropped short in a style that accentuated his sharp jawline and piercing grey eyes. For the next hour, Abby managed to avoid any direct contact with the owner's table, which was being attended to personally by Jeffrey and Thomas, the senior server. She focused instead on her other tables, grateful that her naturally quiet demeanor was an advantage in high-end service, where invisibility was often valued above personality. Her strategy was effective until a commotion broke out at Beaumont's table. "Monsieur, Thomas stammered, his high school French clearly failing him as Beaumont spoke rapidly, his expression growing darker with each passing second. Giselle, his assistant, had stepped away to take a call, leaving Thomas floundering. The restaurant manager had materialized beside them, looking equally perplexed. "He's asking about the seasonal truffle menu and why it's unavailable," Abby found herself saying before she could stop herself. All 3 men turned to stare at her. The manager's face flushed crimson. "Mitchell, get back to your section immediately." "Vous parlez français?" Beaumont interrupted, his intense gaze locking onto Abby with laser focus. Heat crawled up her neck, but years of studying the language with dreams of international business gave her the courage to respond. The room fell into stunned silence as Beaumont dismissed Thomas with a flick of his hand and gestured for Abby to approach. What followed was a rapid exchange that none of the gawking staff could comprehend. Abby explained that the truffle menu was seasonal and would begin the following month, but the chef could prepare a special truffle risotto if Monsieur desired. Far from appearing angry, Beaumont seemed relieved to finally communicate without the clumsy translations of his assistant. By the time Giselle returned, Abby had taken Beaumont's order and was heading towards the kitchen, her heart pounding against her ribs. She could feel the stares of her colleagues burning into her back. "What exactly did he say to you?" Carlos demanded when she pushed through the kitchen doors. "He ordered the risotto special with summer truffles," she replied quietly. "Chef Marcus knows how to prepare it." The head chef, who had been eavesdropping, nodded curtly. "I'll handle it myself." For the remainder of lunch service, Abby became Beaumont's dedicated server, translating his requests and providing information about the restaurant's operations that the management had apparently failed to communicate. To everyone's astonishment, the typically stoic businessman actually smiled once, a brief upward tilt of his lips that transformed his severe features when Abby recommended a particular vintage to accompany his meal. When Beaumont finally departed 3 hours later, the staff exhaled collectively. Geoffrey immediately cornered Abby by the service station. "What exactly did you two discuss all that time?" he demanded. Before she could answer, the restaurant manager appeared. "Mitchell, my office now." Her heart sinking, Abby followed him, certain she was about to be reprimanded for overstepping. Instead, she found herself staring at a business card placed deliberately on the manager's desk. Luc Beaumont's name was embossed in elegant script, and a handwritten note on the back read in perfect English, "Send her to my office tomorrow, 9 o'clock a.m." "Congratulations," the manager said, his tone unreadable. "It seems you've caught the owner's attention. I have no idea what you said to him, but he's requested you personally." "For what?" Abby asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's the thing," he replied, tapping the card. He wouldn't elaborate, but when a man worth 11 billion asks for something, we don't question it. You'll report to Beaumont Industries tomorrow morning instead of your shift here. That night, Abby could barely sleep. Her tiny studio apartment in Queens felt even more claustrophobic as she paced the limited floor space, oscillating between excitement and dread. Had she somehow offended him despite their seemingly pleasant conversation? Was this some elaborate way to fire her? Or could it be something else entirely? By morning, she had cycled through her meager wardrobe 3 times before settling on her most professional outfit, a navy blue dress she'd purchased for job interviews after graduation, before reality had forced her to take the waitressing position. It was simple but well-made, the most expensive piece of clothing she owned. The Beaumont Industries headquarters soared 60 stories above Manhattan, its glass exterior reflecting the morning sun. The security guards in the lobby eyed her skeptically until she presented the business card, at which point their demeanor changed instantly. One personally escorted her to a private elevator that required a special key card. "Mr. Beaumont's office is on the top floor," he informed her. "His assistant will meet you when you arrive." The elevator ascended smoothly, giving Abby precious moments to compose herself. When the doors slid open, she stepped into a minimalist reception area where Giselle sat behind a sleek desk, her expression as impenetrable as her employer's. "Mademoiselle Mitchell," she acknowledged with a slight accent. He's expecting you." Before Abby could respond, the imposing double doors behind Giselle opened and Luke Beaumont himself appeared. Unlike the previous day, he had dispensed with his suit jacket and stood in shirt sleeves, his collar open at the throat. Something about seeing him this way, slightly less formal in his own domain, made him seem both more human and more intimidating. "Miss Mitchell," he said in English, his accent rich and melodic. "Please come in. We have much to discuss about your future." As Abby followed him into the vast corner office with its panoramic views of the city, she couldn't shake the feeling that her life was about to change irrevocably, though whether for better or worse remained to be seen. Luke Beaumont's office was a study in understated luxury. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of Manhattan, while the furnishings, a massive oak desk, leather chairs, and sparse modern art, spoke of wealth that didn't need to shout. Abby perched on the edge of an armchair worth more than her rent, trying not to fidget as Beaumont settled across from her instead of behind his intimidating desk. "You're wondering why you're here?" he stated, rather than asked, his grey eyes studying her with unnerving intensity. "Yes, sir," Abby admitted, grateful that her voice remained steady despite the nervous fluttering in her stomach. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "You called me Monsieur yesterday. I preferred it." "Yes, Monsieur," she corrected, feeling heat creep into her cheeks. Beaumont leaned forward slightly. "Tell me, Mademoiselle Mitchell, how does a waitress at the Silver Spoon speak French with the accent of someone who studied at Sciences Po?" Abby blinked in surprise. He had correctly identified the prestigious Parisian university where she'd spent her exchange semester. "I was in the international business program at NYU," she explained. "I spent a semester in Paris 3 years ago. I was planning to specialize in French-American business relations, but—" She hesitated, unsure how much of her personal circumstances to reveal. "But," he prompted, his gaze unwavering. "Financial circumstances changed," she said simply. "I had to leave the program in my final year. The Silver Spoon position allows me to make enough for rent and to slowly pay down my student loans." Something flickered across his face, not quite sympathy, but a momentary softening of his stern features. "You studied my business," he stated again, not a question. This time, Abby couldn't hide her surprise. "How did you—" "You mentioned my acquisition of Levine Technologies during our conversation yesterday. That was not widely publicized in America. Only someone who followed my business closely would know those details." Abby's mind raced back to their conversation. She'd been so focused on communicating clearly that she hadn't censored her knowledge of his business empire. "So your case study was part of our curriculum," she admitted. "Your approach to revitalizing struggling companies rather than dismantling them was unusual, impressive." For a moment, Beaumont said nothing, his expression unreadable. Then he rose abruptly and walked to the window, hands clasped behind his back. "The American business media has created a certain image of me," he said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "The liquidator, the shark. They claim I acquire companies only to break them apart, that I care nothing for the people whose livelihoods depend on these businesses." He turned back to face her, and Abby was struck by a weariness behind his eyes that hadn't been visible from across a restaurant table. "What they fail to understand," he continued, "is that I grew up in a small town decimated when its primary employer, a factory, was closed by American investors who cared only for short-term profit. My father worked there for 20 years before losing everything. I watched what happens to communities when businesses fail. I have no interest in creating more broken towns, more broken families. Abby sat very still, sensing she was hearing something few people ever had, the personal motivation behind the business empire. The Silver Spoon Group is failing, he stated bluntly. The previous owners extracted profit while neglecting quality and staff training. I did not acquire it to sell its real estate, as your colleagues seem to believe. I acquired it because good restaurants create communities, provide meaningful work, and preserve culinary traditions. But to save it, I need to understand what is happening inside. Understanding dawned on Abby. And you can't get honest information because everyone is terrified of you. The corner of his mouth twitched. Précisément. Even with Giselle translating, I get sanitized versions. Managers tell me what they think I want to hear. Staff members are too frightened to speak candidly. Except me, Abby said softly. Except you, he agreed. You spoke to me directly, honestly, and in my native language. You know my business history well enough to understand my intentions might not align with the rumors. He returned to his seat, leaning forward with an intensity that made Abby sit straighter. I am offering you a position, Mademoiselle Mitchell. For 3 months, you will be my cultural and linguistic liaison. You will accompany me to all 5 restaurant locations, translate not just my words, but the context behind them, and help me understand the true state of operations without the filter of fearful management. In return, I will pay you triple your current salary, provide a clothing allowance appropriate for business settings, and write a personal recommendation for any graduate program of your choosing when the project concludes. Abby's mind reeled. The salary alone would allow her to clear a significant portion of her student debt. The recommendation from someone of Beaumont's stature would open doors that had firmly closed when she'd been forced to abandon her degree. "What about my current position?" she asked, practical concerns momentarily outweighing her shock. "Your job will remain secure. Consider this a special assignment. You would begin tomorrow." "Tomorrow?" she echoed, eyes widening. "I leave for our Chicago location in the morning. The corporate jet departs at 8:00 a.m. He stated this as if private jets were an everyday consideration. Before Abby could respond, the office door opened and Giselle entered with a thin folder. "The background check results, monsieur," she said in French, casting a cool glance toward Abby. Abby froze. Background check. When would they have had time to? "Merci, Giselle," Beaumont replied, accepting the folder but not opening it. "Please prepare the employment contract we discussed earlier." Giselle's perfectly shaped eyebrows rose slightly, but she nodded and withdrew without comment. "You ran a background check on me?" Abby asked, once the door closed. "Of course," Beaumont replied unapologetically. "You would have access to confidential business information. It's standard procedure." A flicker of indignation cut through Abby's nervousness. "And if I hadn't passed?" His grey eyes met hers directly. "Then we wouldn't be having this conversation. But your record is impeccable. Your academic achievements impressive despite your circumstances. And your credit history shows someone who meets obligations despite difficulties. All qualities I value." Abby wasn't sure whether to feel flattered or violated by the thoroughness of the investigation into her life. "I should warn you," Beaumont continued, "Giselle has been with me for 7 years. She is exceptionally loyal and protective of my interests. She will not make your position easy, particularly as she views her role as my primary interpreter." "Why not just continue using her then?" Abby asked. "Because Giselle sees what I want her to see," he replied candidly. She is invaluable, but she is part of my inner circle. You are an outsider who understands both worlds, mine and that of the restaurant staff. You have no reason to hide uncomfortable truths from me. The door opened again, and Giselle returned with a thick document, which she placed on the coffee table between them with barely concealed disapproval. The contract requires signature today if Mademoiselle Mitchell will be joining us tomorrow, she said pointedly. Thank you, Giselle. That will be all for now. Beaumont dismissed her with polite firmness. After she left, Beaumont pushed the contract toward Abby. Take your time to review it. Ask any questions. Abby hesitated, her fingers hovering over the document that could change the trajectory of her stalled life. This is happening very quickly. I make decisions quickly when the right opportunity presents itself, he replied. It's how I've built my success. The question is, Mademoiselle Mitchell, Abby, are you willing to take a risk that could change your future? The use of her first name, spoken in his rich accent, sent an unexpected warmth through her chest. Dangerous, she thought. Getting personally affected by this man would be dangerous in ways she couldn't fully articulate. What if it doesn't work out? She asked quietly. What if I'm not what you expected? Something shifted in his expression, a fleeting glimpse of vulnerability quickly masked by his usual composure. Then we part ways professionally, and you return to your previous position with a generous severance, he said simply. But I rarely misjudge people, Abby, and I don't think I've misjudged you. As she reached for the contract, the weight of the decision pressing on her, Abby couldn't help but wonder what other judgments Luke Beaumont had made about her, and whether she was walking into an opportunity of a lifetime or a complicated situation from which she might not emerge unscathed. 3 weeks into her new role, Abby stood beside Luke Beaumont in the kitchen of the Silver Spoon's Chicago location, translating his rapid-fire questions to increasingly uncomfortable staff members. What had begun as a whirlwind adjustment to private jets, luxury hotels, and designer business attire had evolved into something she hadn't anticipated: genuine partnership. He wants to know why the inventory system shows purchases of premium Wagyu beef 3 times weekly, but the special menu features it only on weekends, Abby explained to the head chef, whose forehead had begun to glisten with perspiration. Tell Mr. Beaumont there must be a clerical error in the system, the chef replied, not quite meeting her eyes. Abby hesitated before translating, something Beaumont immediately noticed. His grey eyes narrowed slightly as he watched the exchange. "Il ment," he said quietly. "He's lying." "I agree," Abby agreed under her breath. After 3 weeks of similar conversations across 4 restaurant locations, she'd developed an intuitive understanding of when staff were being truthful and when they were concealing problems. More surprisingly, Beaumont had begun to trust her judgment implicitly, often seeking her observations after meetings. "Continuance," Beaumont instructed the kitchen staff before placing his hand lightly on the small of Abby's back, a gesture that still sent an involuntary shiver up her spine, and guiding her towards the exit. Once in the relative privacy of the empty dining room, he switched to English, something he did increasingly when they were alone. "You've noticed it too, then? The inconsistencies in inventory?" Abby nodded. "It's the 3rd location with similar discrepancies. Premium ingredients purchased but not accounted for in menu items. Someone is siphoning resources," he concluded, his expression hardening. "The question is whether it's isolated theft or systematic fraud." You suspected this before you hired me, Abby realized suddenly. That's why you needed someone who could communicate directly with staff at all levels without alerting management. A hint of admiration flickered in his eyes. You continue to demonstrate why I was right to bring you into this situation, Abby. The use of her first name still caught her off guard. In public settings, he maintained formality, addressing her as Mademoiselle Mitchell, but in private moments, increasingly frequent as they worked long hours together, he called her Abby, with a softness that contrasted sharply with his usual clipped tone. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we complete our audit discreetly. Tonight, after closing, we'll review their digital records against physical inventory." He checked his watch. "That gives us 4 hours. Perhaps we should take a break before then." Which was how Abby found herself sitting across from Luke Beaumont at a small cafe 3 blocks from the restaurant, watching with fascination as the intimidating businessman meticulously dissected a chocolate eclair with his fork. "My mother made these every Sunday," he explained, noticing her observation. "Not as good as hers, but acceptable." These glimpses into his personal history had become more frequent. Small confidences shared in quiet moments that humanized the man behind the fearsome reputation. "Tell me about your family," he said suddenly. Abby stiffened slightly. Personal questions remained rare between them, their conversations typically focused on business matters. "Not much to tell," she replied carefully. "My father left when I was young. My mother raised me alone until she passed away during my sophomore year of college. That's when the financial problems started." "I'm sorry," he said, and the simple sincerity in his voice made her look up. His expression held none of its usual guardedness. "Cancer," she explained, turning her coffee cup slowly. "The medical bills took everything, including the money set aside for my education. That's why I had to leave the program." A long moment of silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, but weighted with understanding. "I lost my mother young as well," he finally said. 17. My father lived another 10 years, but he was diminished after she passed. Sometimes I think my drive to succeed came from watching him lose his purpose." The admission felt significant. A door briefly opened into the closely guarded personal life of a man the business world viewed as calculating and emotionless. "Is that why you care so much about saving companies rather than dismantling them?" Abby asked. "Because of what happened to your father's factory?" Something shifted in his expression, surprised perhaps at her insight. Before he could respond, his phone vibrated. The moment dissolved as he checked the screen, his features instantly reverting to their business mask. "We need to return to the restaurant now," he said. All traces of warmth vanished. "What's happened?" "The financial director from New York has arrived unexpectedly. He's requesting access to the files we were planning to review tonight." The urgency in his voice propelled Abby to her feet. They made the walk back to the Silver Spoon in intense silence, Beaumont's long strides forcing her to nearly jog beside him. They entered through the front to find the restaurant manager engaged in heated conversation with a thin, nervous-looking man in an expensive but ill-fitting suit. "Mr. Beaumont," the financial director exclaimed, relief washing over his features. "I've been trying to reach you. There are urgent matters." "We'll discuss them in my temporary office, Mr. Dawson." Beaumont cut him off, gesturing towards the restaurant's private dining room that he'd been using as workspace. Abby moved to follow, but Beaumont turned to her. "Mademoiselle Mitchell, please review tonight's reservation list with the maitre d' while I speak with Mr. Dawson." The formal address and dismissal caught her off guard. For weeks, she'd been included in every meeting, every discussion. The sudden exclusion felt like a slap. "Of course, monsieur," she replied, professional mask firmly in place despite the confusion churning inside her. As they disappeared into the private dining room, Abby found herself at loose ends, the maitre d' having already left for the day. Uncertain what to do, she made her way to the small administrative office to review upcoming reservations as instructed. She'd barely logged into the system when raised voices from the adjacent private dining room caught her attention. Though muffled, Beaumont's normally controlled tone had escalated to something approaching anger. More surprising was that they were speaking in English rather than French. "Cannot continue this way," she heard Beaumont saying. "The board is growing suspicious." "It was your idea," Dawson's voice responded, higher-pitched with anxiety. "You said it was the only way to justify the acquisition to the shareholders." "Temporarily," Beaumont hissed, "not as a permanent solution. This ends now before the audit committee discovers the discrepancies." Abby froze, her hand hovering over the keyboard. What discrepancies? Was Beaumont himself involved in financial improprieties? "And what about the girl?" Dawson asked. A longer pause followed, during which Abby held her breath. "She served her purpose," Beaumont replied, his voice so cold and detached that Abby physically recoiled. "Once we've consolidated the Chicago and Boston operations, her position becomes redundant." The blood drained from Abby's face as the implications hit her. Had she been nothing but a convenient tool, a temporary asset to be discarded once her usefulness ended? "She knows too much," Dawson began. He sounded strained. "The inventory problems, the staffing inconsistencies. She only knows what I've chosen to reveal," Beaumont responded with a dismissive tone. "Nothing substantial enough to jeopardize our larger strategies." A wave of nausea washed over Abby. For weeks, she'd been fostering feelings for this man, impressed by his sharp business mind, touched by the rare glimpses of warmth he allowed to peek through his tough exterior, even indulging in daydreams about a relationship that went beyond their professional lives. Now, it seemed she'd simply been a pawn in whatever elaborate game he was playing. The sharp sound of a chair scraping against the floor snapped her back to reality. Her heart hammered in her chest. She quickly shut down the reservation system and moved away from the door just as it swung open. Beaumont walked out, his expression unreadable as his eyes locked onto hers. "Ah, there you are," he said smoothly, as if nothing were amiss. "Mr. Dawson and I have finished our meeting. We'll continue with the inventory review, as we planned." Abby struggled to maintain a neutral expression, to mask the hurt and sense of betrayal that threatened to consume her. "Of course, monsieur." "Is everything all right?" he asked, studying her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "Perfectly fine," she lied, mirroring his cool professionalism. "Just a bit tired from our long day." Something flickered in his eyes, perhaps doubt, but he only nodded. "Then, let's wrap this up quickly so you can get some rest. Tomorrow, we fly to Boston for our final site visit." As she followed him back toward the kitchen, Abby's mind raced with painful clarity. She saw two paths before her. She could confront him with what she'd overheard and risk immediate termination, or she could play along, gathering enough information to fully understand what Luke Beaumont was hiding and whether she had unknowingly become a party to something illegal. The Boston restaurant was housed in a historic building overlooking the harbor, its colonial-era architecture a stark contrast to the sleek, modern design of the Chicago and New York locations. Under different circumstances, Abby might have been charmed by its character. Instead, as she and Beaumont were led through the dining room by the overly enthusiastic manager, she felt a growing sense of foreboding. For the past 24 hours, she had maintained a careful facade of normalcy, translating conversations, taking notes during meetings, and carrying out her duties with mechanical precision, all while meticulously documenting every inconsistency and every suspicious exchange in her mind. The weight of Beaumont's betrayal pressed down on her, but it was now accompanied by something else. A steely resolve. If he had been using her, she was determined to at least understand why before she walked away. The kitchen renovation was completed last month, the Boston manager was saying, gesturing proudly toward the gleaming new equipment. We've increased capacity by 30%, while also reducing energy consumption. Impressive, Beaumont murmured, his gaze sweeping critically over the space. And what about the staff transition? A flicker of discomfort crossed the manager's face. Smooth for the most part. We had a few departures, which is to be expected with new ownership. How many? Beaumont asked sharply. The manager looked to Abby, appealing for help. He's asking how many staff members left, she translated. 12 in total, mostly back-of-house positions. Beaumont's expression darkened. Why wasn't I informed of this? As Abby translated, she watched the manager's composure crumble. Mr. Dawson assured us it was being handled appropriately, he stammered. The severance packages were generous. Dawson again, Beaumont muttered, almost to himself. Show me their personnel files. Immediately. While the manager hurried away, Beaumont turned to Abby. For a fleeting moment, she thought she saw a flash of genuine regret in his eyes. You've been unusually quiet today, he observed. Abby met his gaze steadily. Just focused on the task at hand, monsieur. Monsieur, he repeated softly, you've reverted to formality. It seemed appropriate, she replied, letting the coolness in her voice mirror the tone she'd overheard in his conversation. Given that our working relationship is coming to its conclusion. Something like alarm flickered across his face. What makes you say that? Before she could answer, the manager returned with a stack of files. For the next hour, Abby sat in silence as Beaumont reviewed each personnel record, his expression growing increasingly grim. When he finally closed the last file, his jaw was set in a hard line. We're leaving, he announced abruptly. Our jet departs in 90 minutes. But the evening service inspection, the manager protested, is cancelled, Beaumont cut him off. Expect a call from my office tomorrow. The ride to the airport passed in tense silence. Only when they were settled in the private cabin of his jet did Beaumont finally speak. You overheard my conversation with Dawson? He stated, the words hanging in the air, a confirmation rather than a question. Abby's heart pounded, but she refused to show fear. Yes. He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face in a rare display of weariness. And now you believe I've been using you as part of some elaborate scheme, haven't you? She challenged, allowing her anger to finally breach her carefully constructed facade of composure. You said I'd served my purpose, that I'd be redundant once you'd consolidated operations. I did say those things, he admitted, though not with the meaning you've attributed to them. Then explain, she demanded, past caring about professional boundaries. Explain why you've been systematically removing staff who might question inventory discrepancies. Explain why your financial director is worried about the board discovering whatever you're doing. For a long moment, Beaumont simply studied her, his expression unreadable. Then, to her surprise, He reached into his briefcase and withdrew a thick folder, which he placed on the table between them. "This," he said quietly, "is what I've been trying to protect you from becoming involved in." Abby hesitated before opening the folder. Inside were financial records, personnel files, and inventory reports, all meticulously documenting a pattern of embezzlement and fraud that stretched back years before Beaumont's acquisition of the Silver Spoon Group. "I don't understand," she said, looking up in confusion. "The previous owners didn't just neglect the business. They were using it to launder money through inflated inventory purchases and ghost employees," Beaumont explained. "When I acquired the company, I discovered their scheme, but also realized that exposing it immediately would destroy the entire restaurant group. Hundreds of innocent employees would lose their livelihoods. So instead, you've been quietly cleaning house," Abby realized, the pieces of the puzzle finally falling into place. "Yes, removing the staff who were complicit in the fraud while preserving the legitimate operations." His grey eyes held hers intently. "Dawson was brought in specifically to help me unravel the financial web without triggering external audits that would force immediate disclosure." "And what about my role in all this?" A hint of the warmth she'd grown accustomed to returned to his expression. "Initially, it was a matter of practicality. I needed someone who could help me communicate directly with staff to identify who was involved and who was innocent. But I also needed to shield you from direct knowledge of the fraud investigation to protect you legally." "That's why you excluded me from the meeting with Dawson," she said slowly. "Yes. When I said you'd served your purpose, I meant that you had successfully helped me identify the legitimate employees worth saving across all locations. With that task complete, continuing to involve you would only put you at risk." He leaned forward, his voice softening. "I never intended to simply discard you, Abby. I was trying to protect you." The anger that had sustained her began to dissolve, replaced by a sense of confusion. "Why didn't you just tell me this from the beginning?" "Because knowledge of ongoing fraud creates legal obligations to report it immediately," he explained. "I needed time to save what could be saved," and he hesitated. "I didn't want you to see me as just another ruthless businessman willing to bend the rules." "Why would that matter?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. His eyes locked with hers, a flicker of vulnerability finally visible beneath his carefully constructed control. "Because somewhere between New York and Chicago, you became more to me than just a translator or an assistant, and I began to hope you might see me as more than just your employer." The confession hung between them, transforming the pressurized cabin into an even more rarefied space. Abby's mind raced, weighing his explanation against his actions over the past weeks, the small confidences, the protective gestures, the moments of connection that had nothing to do with business. "What happens now?" she asked finally. "Tomorrow, we present our findings to federal authorities," he said. "The investigation becomes official, and my role shifts to cooperating witness rather than undercover investigator. The Silver Spoon Group will face a challenging transition, but the legitimate parts of the business and the innocent employees will survive." And thus the question slipped out before she could reconsider it. Something softened in his expression. "That depends entirely on you, Abby. Your 3-month contract has another 2 months remaining. You could complete it as planned with the recommendation and compensation we agreed upon. Or, she prompted when he hesitated. "Or you could consider a permanent position, not as my translator." Your talents are wasted there, but helping me revitalize the Silver Spoon Group once the legal matters are settled. You have the business acumen, the people skills, and the integrity this company desperately needs." His voice grew quieter, and selfishly, "I'm not ready to lose your presence in my daily life." The admission, so at odds with the imperious businessman she'd first encountered, made her heart skip. But caution kept her from rushing to accept. "I would need certain assurances," she said carefully. "Complete transparency going forward. No more secrets or exclusion from decisions." And she took a deep breath. A clear understanding of professional boundaries, given the complexity of our working relationship. A genuine smile transformed his features, the first full smile she'd seen from him. Transparency, inclusion, and boundaries. All reasonable requests that I'm happy to accommodate. The pilot's voice interrupted, announcing their imminent descent into New York. As Abby fastened her seatbelt, a sense of possibility replaced the dread that had accompanied her to Boston. "There's a small French bistro in the West Village," Beaumont said as the plane began its descent. "Nothing like the Silver Spoon, just simple, authentic cuisine like my mother used to make. Would you allow me to take you there tomorrow evening?" "Not as your employer, but simply as Luke." The invitation represented exactly the kind of boundary blurring she should be wary of, yet Abby found herself nodding, a smile forming despite her best intentions. "I'd like that," she said softly. "But you should know, I expect full transparency in personal matters as well. No more secrets, Luke." He reached across the table, his hand covering hers in a gesture that felt both protective and promising. "No more secrets," he agreed. "Though I warn you, the truth of who I am may prove less exciting than the rumors." "I'll take that risk," she replied, turning her hand to intertwine their fingers. "After all, I was never particularly interested in the legend of the French billionaire boss. I'm much more intrigued by the man behind it." As the New York skyline appeared through the clouds, Abby realized that sometimes understanding someone's language meant more than just translating their words. It meant seeing past carefully constructed facades to the truth beneath. And in that understanding, unexpected doors could open to futures neither party could have predicted.